Good afternoon, everyone. It's really good to have you on this SAIF webinar. We're thinking about a really important topic today, and I'm delighted that Fiona Greenwood, who's the Operations Director from Rowland Brothers International, is with us. So welcome, Fiona. It's good to have you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And SAIF have a partnership with Rowland Brothers International to offer free advice to SAIF members to do with outbound and inbound repatriations. Also, just to say, SAIF have a number of associates that work in repatriations, and if you're interested in knowing where they are, if you go to the Find a Members and the drop-down Associates directory, and then scroll down to repatriations, you can find those associate members who provide that. But I'm really pleased to have Fiona with us, because this is a really important subject for many of our clients, whether receiving or sending loved ones. So Fiona, over to you, and we'll do questions at the end.
Thank you, Terry. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fiona Greenwood, and I'm the Operations Director for Rowland Brothers International. I've been with Rowland Brothers for 14 years now. And prior to that, I used to work in the travel insurance industry, running the emergency response team. So that's when you buy a travel insurance policy, you go abroad, something happens, you would call for help. So I've got 26 plus years in that industry, both in the United Kingdom and in the United States. Very familiar with repatriations when people pass away. It was a very small percentage of my overall cases. The bulk of them were medical cases where people were still living. So many years of experience, and I'm delighted to go through my presentation today with you all. A little bit of background about who I work for. So Rowland Brothers International, we're recognised as one of the leaders, providers of worldwide funeral assistance. And we developed from the Rowland Brothers Funeral Directors, which was established in 1873. We celebrated last year our 150th anniversary. We have a reputation for the quality of our service and the reliability. And we're a sixth generation family run business, so it's never been sold. The repatriations at RBI started in 1971, and we've built our reputation over 53 years of experience. We've got a huge developed global network of funeral directors who have an excellent reputation for providing a high quality and professional service to their local communities. And our international department has grown to assist funeral directors, insurance companies, assistance companies, corporations, embassies, Metropolitan Police, FCDO, and bereaved families worldwide. Our experienced multi-team is multilingual, multicultural, with a vast international travel experience, and are all dedicated to finding solutions for families bereaved away from home. Everyone in the team that actually deals with repatriations is bilingual. I am personally bilingual. I'm a fluent Spanish speaker. And that's just anybody that we hire in comes with the language. We're also BSI ISO 9001 accredited company. We wanted to do something that proved how serious we are about the quality of the service we provide. So we went down the route of ISO, which is a tremendous amount of work that goes into it. All of our processes, all our different types of repatriations are process mapped, which does help with training. And we're audited every single year, and every 3 years we have a major audit, which dictates whether we get to keep our BSI logo that you can see on the screen. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the key elements and complexities involved in inbound and outbound repatriations. We're not limiting it to the case type today. And it's no different than when you all deal with families for your local funerals. Some of these elements apply for local funerals as well as the repatriations. And when we're dealing with the repatriation, some elements can actually cause timelines to increase, or there could be complications, and there's a lot of explanation to families as to why these things happen. So investigation, whether it's within the United Kingdom on an outbound case, or whether it's abroad on an incoming case, if somebody passes away, say, if they're abroad in a hotel room, there's no obvious reason as to why they passed away, that will be an investigation. No different than in the United Kingdom, where the coroner may want to investigate into the death. That happens when we repatriate from abroad. The timelines on that purely depends on the circumstances as to what's happened, where they were, whether it's in a hotel room, whether it's an accident of some sort. There will be an investigation that takes place. So that's pretty standard across all three groups. Timelines, depending on the country where the person passes away, and the complexities involved with the cause of death, circumstances, the timelines can take longer. We always say typically for repatriation, a timeline that we would quote to families for repatriation, we would say between 7 to 10 days from the time that the authorities actually release the deceased. Now, if that is an investigation and the equivalent of the coroner is involved, then we all know those timelines can be a lot longer. Families, a lot of times it's straightforward with families, but occasionally you do come across families where maybe it's dad that passed away, mum's no longer with them, dad went out to, say, Spain to visit one of the siblings that lives there, passes away, and then you have families, well, they want the funeral in Spain, but the rest of the family want the repatriation to take place to have the funeral back in England. And we're caught in the middle of these family disputes. So it's kind of working through the logistics of the family and who actually is the main person that we should be dealing with that has the final say on what happens. We have on occasion on outbound repatriations from the UK had to put the entire repatriation on hold whilst the families sort things out and come back to us. So families can be quite complex. Identity documents, they vary from country to country as to what different countries require for the identification documents. Identity documents are extremely important for the identification, especially in cases where there's investigations abroad. If somebody is traveling alone, maybe they passed away somewhere and they don't actually have their identification documents on them. So that can actually be quite complex in gathering all of that information to make sure that we actually have everything we need for the authorities and ultimately all of the documentation in place for repatriation to proceed. Registration of death varies from country to country. If somebody is traveling alone again, it might require contacting family back at home. In some countries, they will accept us to email documents across and obtain signatures that way. So it purely depends where the person is, where they pass away, as to how we go about that. The same would apply in the United Kingdom. If they're traveling alone or there's no family in the UK, then it's sorting out the registration of the death so we can proceed with arrangements. The OOE is the out of England, as we all know, depending at what stage the coroner is. If it's an investigation, it could take longer to get an OOE, or it could be straightforward. That's also dependent on what's going on in the particular area where the person passed away as to what the coroner's timelines are. So that could actually cause some delays. We need the OOE before we can actually proceed and do our collection and start moving on the repatriation. Authorities, whether it's in the United Kingdom or abroad, again, vary depending what country the person's passed away in. Some authorities move extremely quickly, and that might be tied into their faith in their own country and how quick they would actually do a funeral in their own country. And in other countries, it can take a lot longer. But we do need to work with the authorities in order to get all of the documentation. Again, embassies, we deal with the embassies. A lot of, they need to provide ultimate authorization. So if it's a British subject that passes away abroad, documentation will go to the British embassy or consulate abroad for them to sign off, and that is all for the repatriation to proceed and entry back into the United Kingdom. The logistics, so on our repatriations coming inbound, we work with our logistics team at Rowland Brothers, who also manage all of the local funerals. So that is a major job in putting everything together to make sure you've got the drivers in the correct places, that you can do the collections, you can do the deliveries. And it's also working with the logistic teams abroad and the logistics of the airlines to put everything together for repatriation. Okay, to forward, that relates to airlines. So when you actually manage a repatriation, whether it's inbound or outbound, and you seek space on the flight, for that repatriation to take place, the airline will not proceed with firm confirmation of that booking until they receive what they call an okay to forward. And what that basically means is the airline will contact the consignee in the country where the repatriation is taking place to, and the consignee needs to okay the forwarding of that deceased. What the airlines don't want to do is do a repatriation, get somebody back to their home country, and then there's nobody available to collect them from the airport. So that's really, really important. If the person is infectious, then again, depending what country we're repatriating to, that may or may not present issues. Some countries are fine, some aren't. But that is basically on a case-by-case basis, and we would need to issue various documents to confirm with an FFI and that they're not infectious. Consignee is the company that would collect from the airport that the coffin's been assigned to for collection. If we're doing inbound back into the United Kingdom, we, Rowland Brothers International, would be consignee from airports in London, Gatwick, Heathrow, depending where we're going to. If it's a flight going into Scotland, then we would work with some of our partners in Scotland, and they would become the consignee to collect from the airport. Same going outbound from the UK out, a consignee. A lot of times we would work with our established funeral agents around the world, and appoint them as consignees to collect from the airport and ultimately deliver to the receiving funeral directors. 1 second, sorry, I've hit the wrong button. Right, so information to get started, outbound or inbound repatriation. So some key information that we would need in order to get going, whether that is to provide a quote to somebody or actually start arrangements. So we need the full name and address of the deceased person, the date of death, place of death, cause of death or circumstances of death. Sometimes at the very beginning when we're contacted, in that first communication, all of the information isn't provided. It will come in stages. But this is in general what we would be looking to receive. Date of birth is important. Is that location of the deceased, including the town, city, country, and contact information. So we get many cases where we'll be notified and we'll be given a name of a hospital abroad. But actually that hospital may exist in 6 or 7 different countries. So it's really important that we drill down to find out the exact location that we're dealing with. The town and city and country that we're repatriating to, It's really important. And the full name and address of the next of kin and contact information. And also an indication whether the family wishes for final resting, burial or cremation. So that is really important. In a lot of instances, the authorities abroad want to know ultimately what the final wishes are when we actually repatriate back to the United Kingdom. And it actually goes down on their documentation. So if it's a cremation, they'd want to know if it's a burial. And sometimes we actually have to provide information as to the exact location of the crematorium or the exact location of the cemetery that they're going to be buried in. Outbound, standard paperwork required. Once we get going, we need a passport. We will need the out of England, death certificate, embalming certificate, freedom from infection certificate, funeral director's declaration, and airway bill. Now, if we're actually managing the repatriation ourselves, these are a lot of the things that we would do. We would actually apply to the coroners for the out of England. We would have a copy of the death certificate. We'd check the passport to make sure we've got all of that. Our embalmer here at Rowland Brothers would complete the embalming and issue the appropriate certificate. So it could be embalming certificate or sanitization, depending on the circumstances of death as to which one takes place. FFI would be obtained if the deceased does not have an infectious or did not pass away with an infectious disease. Funeral director's declaration, that's the declaration at the time of closing the coffin. So that would be issued from us. And because we're actually arranging all of the flight arrangements, we would actually produce the airway bill. Some funeral directors may come to us and may do a lot of the work themselves, but may just want us to help with the freight side of things and the issuing of the airway bill. So we would also look to do that. As a comparison on outbound cases, it's just to kind of show the difference in documentation. Some countries are very straightforward in what they require, and others are more complicated. So I thought I'd put on the screen two very different countries. So an outbound case going back to China versus one going to Jamaica. I've highlighted in yellow on the screen the documentation that is identical for both, okay? But as you can see, if we look at China, there are so many more documents that are required. Also, on some of the documents, for instance, the death certificate going to China, they need 2 copies, that's fine, but we need to actually legalize that document at the FCDO. The out of England needs to be legalized. The embalming certificate needs to be notarized and legalized. Free from infection needs to be notarized and legalized. The funeral director's declaration with flight details needs to be notarized and legalized. So that actually takes more time. So if we're repatriating to Jamaica, we can move a lot faster because we don't need to do notarization or legalization of the documentation. So we can move a lot quicker with the repatriation to Jamaica versus China. In addition, on the China side, we need to group and bind with Black Ribbon. They're very, very particular in how they want documentation presented to them. And so we actually have to bind with the Black Ribbon, say, for instance, the out of England, plus the notarization of the out of England needs to be binded together. They're extremely particular. When we go up to the embassy, we need to actually present all of the documentations, and all of these documents needed to be binded, you know, where it's a document, but it's got the legalization, attached notarization. So we need to group them all together. And there's various different things the family need to do. So the family need to, they need to apply an application form to be completed by the family. It must be typed. It's not allowed to be handwritten. RBI staff sign it. with the signature of the agent, because we're actually managing the repatriation on behalf of the family. And then there's all these other documents. As you can see, you go from one extreme to another. Some are extremely quick, and others the timeline's going to be longer, just to all these additional documentations. You might have to wait in order for the family to gather certain documents together. They may not have them all in one go, so the timelines could actually be longer. We always endeavour to repatriate somebody as soon as possible, because that's part of our job. But sometimes you do have to comply with the rules and regulations of the country you're repatriating to. So all of these formalities have to take place. A case study on an outbound, just to kind of go through this. This was a transfer back to Belarus. Okay, so we proceeded to follow all of the formalities with the official translation of all the documents, obtain the apostille of documents with the FCDO, and we arranged an appointment at the Polish embassy to collect the transit permit for repatriation to Belarus via Poland, and the relevant permissions from the Polish embassy. It involved a post-mortem by a UK coroner and return of deceased luggage to travel at the same time as the coffin. The timeline was longer than a straightforward repatriation due to all the circumstances surrounding this particular case. We did a collection of the deceased in the UK, embalming, preparation of the deceased for transfer, placement in coffin and transfer of coffin and luggage to Heathrow Airport were all completed by Rowland Brothers Funeral Home premises in Croydon. With our international operative ensuring all was completed in time for the flight. The deceased and luggage arrived in Warsaw and was collected by an overseas funeral agent in Poland and delivered the next day to the family in Belarus. That kind of just shows the complexities involved in some of the repatriations. We couldn't actually repatriate directly to Belarus from the United Kingdom, hence the reason why we went via Poland, okay? And in today's world, there are a lot of sanctions involved with countries as to what can be done and what can't be done. So we have to be very mindful as to what rules apply to us in the United Kingdom, what we can, what we can't do. But because we have such a brilliant network of funeral directors all around the globe, we can overcome most situations, and we can always find a way in order to complete a repatriation of somebody that needs to go home. So that we've touched a little bit on the outbound repatriation. So if we're looking at inbound, where it's a death abroad. So what needs to happen abroad? So the death needs to be registered according to the local regulations in order to obtain a death certificate. The agents we work with will advise us how this is done. In some instances, they can actually do it. In others, we may need documentation from the family in order to facilitate that. To obtain a British-style death certificate for death abroad, the families can, in addition, register via the FCDO website. It will take a while before they get this particular death certificate. So typically, a repatriation will take place, the coffin will come back with all of the original documents, and there will be a local death registration from the country where they passed away. Sometimes it comes also attached with a medical death certificate, because the actual death certificate won't list necessarily a cause of death. So depending what country they pass away with is the type of documents that we will receive back. Information to require for registration of death, they need the full name of the deceased, date of death, date of birth, the passport number, where and when the passport was issued, details of the next of kin. And in some countries, if the deceased person was married, they will require a copy of the marriage certificate is also required. Now, you can appreciate for some families, they may not necessarily know where all of these documents are. So it may take them a little while to gather some of these documents together in order to forward them on for registration to take place. Documentation required to repatriate to the UK, the death certificate, it's not always in English, okay? Authorization to remove the deceased from the country, embalming certificate, the coffin must be zinc lined or body sealed. So that depends on the country regulations from where we're repatriating from as to what needs to take place. Who do you need to inform? So on inbound repatriation, once if we were working with you and we were arranging a repatriation and you are the funeral home that ultimately that deceased is going to, the coroner for the jurisdiction where the burial or cremation is to take place, the coroner will want to see the death certificate and any associated medical reports that have been sent with the deceased. The coroner will then decide if a post-mortem is required. So all paperwork received from abroad must be forwarded to the coroner with next of kin details, along with the funeral director's standard forms requesting permission for cremation or burial. It is for the coroner to then decide if a post-mortem will take place or not. So the coroner will review the documentation that comes from abroad, and then they will make that ultimate decision. That's no different than in the United Kingdom. When somebody passes away, the coroner will make the ultimate decision as to whether they want to investigate further or whether they're going to issue all of the documentation for a funeral to take place. So considerations for inbound regulations. So the regulations of the country you are repatriating from need to be adhered to. Embalming abroad is not always up to UK standards. It varies, okay? And the reason for that, in some countries, the embalming is actually done by the forensic medical institutes. And a lot of times it's done in accordance with the standards that would take place for local funerals in the country where you passed away. So occasionally it would be like, for instance, if we take a look at Spain, for instance, normally their funerals take place within 24 to 48 hours or 48 hours. So a lot of times embalming, if they're done by the Forensic Medical Institute, embalming will be in accordance with that kind of timeline. So that's something that we need to take into consideration. Also, some countries actually don't embalm the same way we do in the United Kingdom, because they may just do what they call superficial embalming, which for us is more like a sanitization. So that's why I always say they're not always up to UK standards. There are many countries that do actually embalm to the standards that we're used to, but it doesn't happen everywhere in the world. Some countries do not list the cause of death on the death certificate. So if you're doing a repatriation from France or any of the French colonies, Portugal now, and a few other countries, they will not have the cause of death on the death certificate. Now, in France and the French colonies, the cause of death can be requested, but the family would have to request that. And normally it's via the town hall in the area where the person passed away in order to obtain that information. I would imagine in some cases, the UK coroner would probably decide to do a post-mortem to establish cause of death because they don't have any documentation that's coming back that provides them with that information, unless it was evident that they passed away in an accident. They may want to investigate further. So that can be a bit tricky on arrival back in the United Kingdom. And other considerations, because of the situation with embalming standards abroad, we always recommend funeral directors in the United Kingdom to open the coffin as soon as permitted to do so by the coroner and check the condition of the deceased prior to any family viewing. We have had, or we have seen in the past, where coffins have been opened in front of families. And obviously embalming may not have been up to UK standards, or maybe due to the cause of death, their loved one wasn't necessarily in a viewable condition. So it is vital, and it is so important that that is done by funeral directors to check things out. Maybe funeral director can do something, but certainly prior to actually having a family view their loved one. Okay, it will save a lot of upset if things, need to be done. So we actually run the SAIF repatriation helpline, and any questions or any help or any assistance that anybody needs concerning anything to do with repatriations, whether it's inbound, outbound, whether it's domestic, whether it's just a question, whether you need help, please call the helpline, and we'll be more than happy to assist you. If you don't want to actually place a call because maybe you're busy, just ping us an email, and our team will actually address your questions and get back to us. I know this is very short. I can talk about repatriations for hours and hours and hours and hours. And there's so many different complexities involved, depending where the person died, what the circumstances of death are. But I'm more than happy to, answer any questions, or you can always email me. Or I told Terry that I'm going to Scotland to the AGM. So please, give me a shout. More than happy to help anybody out with any information that's required. So Terry, that's the end of mine. So I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you.
Really thorough and really interesting for me as well. So thank you very much. We've got a question from Mark, which is about what sort of forms are required for Scotland, and I probably want to tag Northern Ireland as well.
Yeah, so from Scotland and that, actually we're kind of updating, because I understand there's been some recent changes. So are we talking about what forms are required from Scotland for outbound repatriations to abroad, or are we talking about transfers back into mainland UK, or
what have we got? Outbound.
Okay, outbound documentation. Basically, a lot of the forms are the same as I've gone through in the presentation. There is a question at the moment, and my operations manager is actually clarifying that for Scotland, because I know that you've had some recent changes revolving around the out of England form. So we've actually experienced some repatriations recently where we still have been required to present an out of England, but I know that is something that's changed recently. So I don't have a firm answer on that particular document, but Terry, I will endeavour to establish that for sure. And if I can come back to you, Terry, and you can address it back to whoever asked the question.
So. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Okay.
So,
in terms of the countries, the sort of top 3 countries that you would repatriate to, what would those countries be?
Okay, so repatriations out of the UK, we do a lot to Jamaica, Nigeria. We do a lot out to Thailand. And in Europe, we actually do quite a number of repatriations, Romania, Bulgaria, those kind of destinations.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Inbound's totally different. So top inbound would be Spain. So we've got Spain, France, Greece, all the typical touristic destinations that our Brits go to tend to be the main countries that we would repatriate to. And also we have a very high number of repatriations back to Italy. Italy is also up there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. If I could just go back 5 years to the COVID pandemic,
Yes.
what were the particular challenges for you during that time?
Okay, so the particular challenges throughout COVID, I mean, it all happened so fast, didn't it? So we work with, we do a lot of work with emergency response teams for the travel insurance industry, which happens to be my background before I came into the funeral sector. And so what was happening, we had a number of cases on the go where we had just literally been appointed to manage a repatriation. But then all of a sudden, COVID hit. And it was global. So it was quite awful for families. Everything came to a stop. And then you had this big question mark over whether COVID could be passed on from somebody who's passed away. Or you had people that were in hospital that passed away abroad because they contracted COVID. So then the rules and the regulations of the country where they passed away kicked in. I remember one particular case that was really, really heartbreaking, and it happened in Peru. So the gentleman passed away in the morning. We were notified, we were involved. And by the afternoon, he had already been cremated. There was no option for the family involvement at all. That's what they were doing with their own citizens. If confirmation was COVID, that's what happened. Practically immediately, cremation took place. So we had lots of really sad cases like that around the world. In the case in Peru, it then took about three to 4 months before we could actually repatriate the gentleman's remains back to the United Kingdom. So a lot of places were put on hold, depending where they passed away. If countries had really good refrigerated facilities, then they were stored until time that repatriations could take place. In countries where that wasn't the case, again, if their local rules and regulations indicated that a burial or a cremation needed to take place, that's what happened. It was extremely challenging. And also we had repatriations, obviously, of foreign nationals that were in the United Kingdom that wanted to be repatriated home, but you couldn't do that. So again, everything was on hold, slightly different in the UK because of our brilliant embalming, facilities. The embalmers just do a fantastic job. So we were able to kind of delay those until the world opened back up. But what happened is all the flights stopped too. So you couldn't actually move anybody. And then when things started to open up, again, it was very sporadic around the world as to which countries opened up, which ones didn't. And it was a time where everything changed every 2 seconds. So the rules and regulations on the slide I gave you for the document, all of a sudden there was increased documentation required, and that was changing every 2 seconds. So it was extremely challenging. Obviously, the caseload went down because nobody obviously was traveling. But those cases that we did have were complex. It was a lot of hand-holding with families. And for families, it was just a very, very, very sad time.
Thank you. We've got a final question from Ross in Scotland. I don't know if you can read it.
Yeah, he's put, for Scotland, Form 14, death extract, embalming, FFI. Okay, thank you, Ross, for that information. I will, we do work with Ross, so I'll make sure that Natalie's got your update concerning the documentation. Thank you.
Okay. So just to say to members, SAIF Repatriation Helpline is there, the telephone number, the email. This is a free service, unconditional to members for advice, input. And Fiona, thank you so much for all that you do for our members.
Really you're most certainly welcome.
Thank you.
We're very passionate about what we do, and we're all in it ultimately, aren't we, for the families? So yeah, any questions, any help that's needed, please at any time feel free to contact us.
That's marvelous. Thank you all.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.